Henry the Killer King exploded within his own coffin during his funeral. What a pitiful end for a once all-powerful king. Did Henry VIII really explode? King Henry VIII is a man who hardly needs an introduction. He is well known as being the ruthless king who ruled with an iron fist. Strong-willed and bullish, he handed out executions to anyone who stood in his way. He developed a habit of divorcing his wives, most often at the edge of an axe. He had no patience for women, especially those he was married to, and failed to provide him with a male child. However, if it were not for his terrible treatment of women, the English Reformation might have never happened, and England could still be a Catholic country today. Ultimately, the only way he could divorce his numerous wives was to start his own church. But even though he knew how to silence his wives in a way that very few men know how to, he is probably best known for being excessively overweight. However, he wasn't always fat like that. He used to be incredibly fit and athletic at one point. But following his last infamous jousting accident in January 1536, Henry suffered massive head trauma. Today, medical professionals believe this changed his personality and drove him to the tyranny that he is often associated with. In addition to the head injury, Henry also suffered leg injuries. This would lead to the formation of open ulcers that persisted for the rest of his life. The apparent injuries from the jousting accident were probably not the most important factor that caused his death. The once active and exercise-loving king could no longer indulge in his favorite pastimes. The long 6-hour hunts, tennis games, and of course the jousts became a thing of the past. However, Henry's enormous appetite didn't moderate in line with his reduced activity. Consequently, his waistline increased. At the time of his death, it was estimated that the king probably weighed over 400 pounds. Due to his heavy diet and obesity, Henry likely suffered from untreated type 2 diabetes. However, this cannot be proven. After spending a decade in pain from his many illnesses and eating himself to obesity, he died. When Henry died, his death was kept secret for several days while his counselors scrambled for power. It took at least 3 days before the embalmers were allowed to work on his body. This wasn't a good thing, as you can imagine. In Tudor era, funerals usually took place a month after a person died. They would be embalmed by removing the internal organs, then stuffing the body cavity with sawdust and aromatic herbs. The body would be wrapped in waxed cloth and then sealed inside a lead envelope before being placed in a coffin. The wooden effigy on top would represent the body rather than showing the actual corpse. In Henry's case, the funeral took place 2 weeks after his death. The embalmers did the best they could with his body, but it seems likely that decay had already set in. As his body was being transported in a lead-lined coffin to his final resting place in St. George's Chapel, the unthinkable happened. As his body lay overnight at Sion Monastery, the body of Henry VIII exploded in his coffin, spilling onto the floor. As luck would have it, some dogs were on hand to lick up the spilled remains of the once almighty powerful King of England. This event has also been tied to a prophecy that a friar once preached to him 12 years earlier. The story of the coffin exploding and dripping fluids on the chapel floor is actually not unreasonable, especially given that when his coffin was discovered about 100 years later, so they could place the body of Charles I in Henry's vault, both the wood coffin and the internal lead coffin were severely damaged and his skeleton was visible. When a person dies, the body begins to decompose into simpler organic material. This decomposition creates gases, which are part of the process. The gases are trapped in the body, mainly in the abdomen, and the body starts to look bloated. The gases will continue to build until they are able to escape, which happens when the body ruptures and spills the content of the deceased. This rarely happens today thanks to proper embalming techniques. The embalming process slows down the decomposition process and preserves the body. While embalming was in use at the time of Henry's death, it was not as refined as it is today, and his body may have never undergone the procedure. Do you think Henry's body exploded, or is it just a good yarn made up by his enemies after his death?